You can find eerie stories in almost every corner of these isles, thanks to its long and often bloody history. From witch trials to dangerous criminals lurking in our city's shadows, gruesome tales of tortures to battlegrounds stained with blood. And all that history leaves ghostly footprints on our present. But let's face it, for centuries we've loved to listen and recount those eerie tales of our homeland. In books, on screens, but the oldest and my personal favourite is oral storytelling. There's just something slightly more chilling when someone recounts these tales out loud, all the while your imagination runs wild. So I'm here to take you on an excursion, off the beaten path and into the shadows, to hear from local experts about eerie tales right on their, and possibly your, doorstep. My name is Amy Gill, and I have always been fascinated by the dark stories from across the country. So, come with me as we embark on our very own eerie excursion. Well, welcome back to Eerie Excursions. This week we're in the UK's second city of Birmingham. It's so hard to say that without putting on the accent. But anyway, you'll find the city in the West Midlands. It's most famous for its iron, steel, and high-skilled industries. But for a modern audience, you may associate it most with Tommy Shelby and his Peaky Blinders. Now, I won't lie, as I meet my guide Al, who I will introduce in a minute, I did ask him about Birmingham's gangs in the early 20th century. But the truth is, the city has many more eerie stories to tell. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Al.
Yeah, so my name's Al Hassel and I'm the owner of Explore Birmingham. So I do guided tours around Birmingham for locals and visitors. So I've been doing that for 2 years now. And it's a bit of a career change because I am born and bred in Birmingham and I love my city. So I love telling people all about the stories that they perhaps don't know about really. And a bit of fun, bit of a chat, bit of a chance for people to find out the other side of Birmingham from a real Brummie who loves his city.
So I meet Al at Birmingham New Street, and there we walk through the city centre, passing the Christmas markets, of course. The walk is admittedly much steeper than I expected, and it's a crisp, clear, but cold day.
Okay, well, we're currently in St Paul's Square in Birmingham's Jewellery Quarter. So St Paul's Square is actually the last remaining Georgian square in Birmingham. So we're here on a beautiful November afternoon. So it's lovely and sunny, and we can see that it's, there's a lovely green here, but also we're looking at a lot of Georgian buildings. Some of them are a bit more recent than that as well. You've got hotels and bars. Most of these are either businesses or restaurants and bars and things like that. To say we're in the jewellery quarter, so in the streets around here we've got some cobbled streets and railway arches and all that kind of thing. So if I tell you a little bit about Birmingham's Jewellery Quarter and the history of Birmingham itself, because we are the UK's second city from the middle of the 20th century, but sometimes we're a little bit overlooked, I think, and some people don't know too much about Birmingham. So, I mean, it started off tiny. There's even a mention of Birmingham in the Domesday Book of 1086, but it really was small. It takes some time to grow, but it starts to grow initially as a market town around the Bullring. I think Birmingham really starts to expand, though, when we get into the 18th century. So it really is associated then with innovation and industry that starts to arrive, particularly with the arrival of the canals, because being in the middle of the country, not being on a major river, Birmingham's had some disadvantages up until then, but once the canals start arriving, that really fuels Birmingham's industry and innovation, particularly associated with the Industrial Revolution and the development of steam power. As we move through the 18th and 19th century, Birmingham's associated with all kinds of industries, particularly really high skill industries as well. So it was the town of workshops and the place that would make guns and jewellery and all kinds of wonderful things that required high levels of skill. So particularly up until the 20th century, Birmingham's industry carried on into the 20th century. It's associated more with the motor industry. Still a manufacturing city today, but it's a much more mixed economy, really. So yeah, and we're in the jewellery quarter at the moment. As I mentioned, that was one of Birmingham's industries, particularly from the 18th, but once we get into the 19th century, this area becomes associated with jewellery manufacturing, and by the middle and then the late 19th century is the preeminent area for jewellery manufacturing in the UK. Today, it still produces around 40% of the jewellery that's made in the UK just in this area. And the biggest school of jewellery in Europe is here in Birmingham's Jewellery Quarter, and it's one of the biggest collection of jewellery businesses in the world. So yeah, you can't necessarily see that in the square that we're in at the moment, but a few streets away, pretty much every business is going to be gold or diamonds or jewellery or something like that.
Oh wow! I feel like I'm very underdressed. We're in the jewellery quarter.
Where's the bling, Amy?
Exactly, there's no bling. Don't have enough money for any bling. That's cool. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the stories that you might share with people in this square?
Yeah, so my Dark Side tour runs through the Jewellery Quarter into Birmingham city centre. The reason I chose the Jewellery Quarter is because, as you can see, as we've been walking around, there are some really characterful squares. There's lots of cobbled streets and there's all the nice old lampposts as well. So you can imagine after dark, it's quite atmospheric. And it's a real mix as well. We've got the Georgian housing, but we've also got the cobbled streets, narrow back alleys, railway arches, canals. So there's a variety here, and it's a mix of stories that I tell as we walk through the Jewellery Quarter. So there are a few ghosts thrown in there, of course, Amy, as you'd expect. I mean, we've got the ghost of a 10-year-old girl who was sadly murdered in the Jewellery Quarter. We've got a grey lady here as well, as you're always likely to get. She's associated with the smell of pear drops, actually. So
I've not
yeah,
heard pear drops,
yeah, I've got some in my bag if you want one. I always carry them, so if people don't know what pear drops smell like on the tour, they're going to get to try one. So yeah, we've got, so there's a few ghosts associated with the area. In the square that we're in, I tell a story about a ghost as well. A little bit different though to the kind of the usual spooky, scary ghost stories. So I always ask people when we arrive in the square, because there's quite a lot of locals that come on this tour, they want to do something different for an alternative kind of Friday night out. So they come on a tour like this. So I always ask them what they think of St Paul's Square. And I'll tell you, Amy, without a doubt, every single one of them has told me that they think this is a lovely square, whether it's during the day, during the evening. I think so too. I've never seen any problems in this square. So then I tell them about the ghost that haunts here. So I take them to the gravestone. We're literally looking at it just now. It's just under that bush that we're looking at over there. So this is the grave of Moses Barber. Now, Moses Barber died of tuberculosis, aged 40 in 1853. He is noted to be the first police officer in Birmingham to die whilst he was still a serving officer. Now, he lived locally and this was his patch, and it is believed this continues to be his patch in death as well. So the stories have been passed down that he continues to haunt the square through the police force as well. All these hard-headed police officers I've seen, in the 1960s, they used to tell the police officers they didn't need to bother with the square because Moses was looking after the square. Spoken to police more recently, they say, no, you don't get away with that anymore. But they do still pass his story on and they still say that he haunts the square. So I have to say, I do wonder, with all the hundreds of people I've spoken to now who never see any trouble in this square, maybe it is because we have the spirit of a police officer keeping an eye on us, making sure that we're safe whilst we're here. So
I love that idea, because often with ghosts you hear horrible stories or it's all spooky, but you've got a protective ghost.
Why should they always be scary?
Exactly.
Why? Absolutely.
And as we tip our hats and thank Moses for his service, we head out of St Paul's Square up to the street, to the heart of the Jewellery Quarter, passing the rows of shops that Al mentioned, a busy square, and eventually we get to... This feels like a cemetery now.
Yes. Yeah. Rather than a church. Yeah. This is one of the main cemeteries in Birmingham from the 19th century. So there's some catacombs as well that we can drop down to.
Being November, the leaves crunch beneath our feet. There are a few dog walkers, but other than that, we are alone for the most part in the cemetery, with nothing but the crows.
Okay, so we're now stood in Worston Lane Cemetery. We've just been looking at the plaque that tells us that this is the final resting place for John Baskerville. I always ask people actually whether they've heard of John Baskerville. Is it a name that you're familiar with at all, Amy? So, it's funny because a lot of people will say to me, the first thing they'll say, oh, is it the Hound of the Baskervilles? And it's not necessarily a no to that, actually, because surprisingly, Conan Doyle, obviously writer of Sherlock Holmes, he was a GP in Birmingham for a while when he was younger. So he would have known the name Baskerville. So there are, I think, I'm not a Holmes or Conan Doyle expert at all. I believe there's a number of theories as to people who believe where the Hound of the Baskervilles was based on in terms of location, but certainly in terms of name, it's not completely unfeasible to think that he was familiar with the name Baskerville because of his time in Birmingham. But you will know Baskerville. Everybody knows Baskerville, and I'll tell you why. It's because when you're in Microsoft Word and you're scrolling down the fonts to get to Comic Sans, yeah, you'll go past Baskerville font because he was, in the 18th century in Birmingham, he was a really successful businessman, but one of the things that he was a printer and typeface designer as well. So he designed Baskerville font, the font that's got his name and that we still use today. So John Baskerville, important man in Birmingham during the 18th century, died in 1775. Of course, it's not his life that I talk about on my dark tour. Of course, I tell you what happened to him after he died, because his corpse has, shall we say, quite an adventure, really, and it's a bit of a grim story, Amy. So I can tell you what happened to him after he died in 1775. He left really specific instructions about his burial, because he's often referred to as an atheist, but he probably wasn't an atheist, but he was very anti-organised religion. So can I read a little bit to you about what he actually said? He left instructions that he wanted to be buried on his own land. Now, his own land it's not called this anymore. It's kind of where Birmingham Library is now. But it was called Easy Hill when he lived there. Was outside of what was the heart of Birmingham then. So he had some, land. He had a nice house. He had some land there. And when he died in 1775, he requested that his body be placed in a conical building in my own premises, heretofore used as a mill, which I have lately raised higher and painted, and in a vault, which I have prepared for it. This doubtless to many may appear to be a whim. Perhaps it is so, but it is a whim for many years resolved upon, as I have a hearty contempt for all superstition, the farce of a consecrated ground, the Irish barbarism of sure and certain hope, etc. He was quite outspoken, as you can see, and actually even his epitaph, let me read this to you. This was the epitaph that he wrote for himself. So, remember, he's buried beneath this kind of conical structure that he wanted in his own land. And he said, stranger, beneath this cone in unconsecrated ground, a friend to the liberties of mankind directed his body to be inhumed. May the example contribute to emancipate thy mind from the idle fears of superstition and the wicked arts of priesthood. I mean, you can get a sense of John Baskerville from his own words.
I mean, I suppose the 18th century would have been the age of enlightenment, but still, this is before Darwin.
Yeah, and he probably did have some religious belief himself, but really very anti-organised religion and the priesthood, as you've heard from there. So he left really clear instructions that he wanted to be buried on his own land. In Easy Hill, as I say, it's probably about a 10-minute walk away from here. We've just been looking at the plaque here in Worston Lane Cemetery in the Jewellery Quarter, because this is his final resting place, but it took him 125 years to get here from Easy Hill, where he was first buried. And that's the story that I tell people as we walk around the tour, because he has a couple of adventures, shall we say. So I start off by telling people that he's buried here, but he was originally buried in Easy Hill. And he did have some peace there for kind of nearly 50 years before we get to the 1820s. At that point, the canals have arrived into that part of Birmingham. There's lots of excavation. His coffin comes up out of the ground, and it seems that there are no next of kin or anybody that can legally or legitimately take charge of his coffin. So it simply gets moved to a warehouse nearby. We don't really know why, but the people who do have charge of the body decide they're going to see how he's doing. So they prise the lid off the coffin to have a look.
So this is about over 50 years.
This is the 1820s. The sources are a little bit of variance as to the exact date, but we're looking at around about 50 years after he's been buried. So you're wondering about the decomposition. This is the interesting thing, because it was a lead coffin that he was buried in. It's done an incredibly good job of preserving the body. So when they open it, apparently, lovely details that you get in some of the records. There's a wonderful smell of cheese. But the shroud that the body is wrapped in is intact, and when they look, he's still in really good condition: hair, eyes, teeth, skin. So he's looking quite presentable. So maybe it's for that reason they decide they can make some money from him and start showing his corpse to members of the public who are prepared to pay for the pleasure. So, I mean, this guy is such an important man in Birmingham in his life, and now in death, I mean, the indignity just on a warehouse table being shown to members of the public for a few pennies. So pretty grim. That's not the end of his story, unfortunately. He has a few more adventures. So we're in the jewellery quarter at the moment, and about 10 minutes away where he was dug up was where the warehouse was. He then moves about a 10-minute walk away from there to a street which is now known as Colmore Street in Birmingham, right in central Birmingham, where Birmingham Cathedral is. At the time, it was known as Monmouth Street. And there was a man on Monmouth Street who had premises there called Job Marston. Now, we don't really know why he ended up with the body, but he does end up with the body, and he carries on showing him to members of the public who are prepared to pay a few pennies for the pleasure. I mean, it's starting to decay a bit now, as you can imagine, but tell you what though, Amy, you don't have to imagine it. Do you want me to show you what he looked like? Are you prepared for this?
I think I am prepared.
You weren't expecting this? Yeah. So, whilst he was there at Joe Marston's premises, a local artist called Thomas Underwood made a sketch, which was apparently said to be a very good likeness. So this was what he was looking at that point.
Oh wow, that is very rapid. If you could describe it a little bit for us, the listeners.
And what you're looking at is something that's not quite a skull yet, but you know, those eyes have now gone and they're really sunk in. All the lips have kind of gone and most of the skin, so the nose is kind of just a cavity now, but we've got those kind of teeth. It's pretty much bones now, that with perhaps some amount of skin that's left on them, and then what looks like a cavity that's starting to appear around the lower abdomen. So yeah, quite a haunting image, I think. So people are starting to feel ill when they go to see him, not surprisingly. One man who visits is a local surgeon who decides he's going to take a souvenir with him. It's not as bad as it could have been. What he does, he cuts off a piece of the shroud that the body is wrapped in. So he pops that piece of shroud into his pocket and is dead within days. So is born the curse of John Baskerville's shroud. So I have to say, that shroud is in the archives of the Library of Birmingham. I've never asked permission to see a cursed shroud. I think I'm going to leave it where it is. But yeah, so I mean, Joe Marston is now thinking, this is crazy. People are feeling ill. Somebody's died. We need to get him buried. So he goes to the church warden at St Philip's Church. It's now the cathedral, but St Philip's Church at the time, to ask permission to bury John Baskerville in the consecrated churchyard. But of course, you'll remember what John Baskerville has said about the priesthood and his belief he didn't want to be buried in consecrated ground. As you know, the church warden at St Philip's refuses permission for that. But Joe Marston has a friend called Mr Knott. Mr Knott says to him, well, you can have my burial vault in Christchurch in Birmingham. So Joe Marston says, well, thank you very much. And of course, he's got the same problem. He needs to convince the church warden at Christchurch to have him buried there. So he goes to see the church warden at Christchurch and says, can we bury John Baskerville in your consecrated burial vaults? And of course, with the reputation that John Baskerville's got, that is refused. But the amazing part of this story is the church warden says, however, on such and such a day, I shall not be at home and the keys will be on the hall table. So he's not given official permission, but Joe Marston knocks on the church warden's door on the appointed day. It's opened by the servant. Servant invites him into the hall. He says, is the church warden at home? No, he's not. The servant then leaves him in the hall. Sure enough, key to the church on the hall table. So that evening with his friends, they were able to come and bury John Baskerville in the burial vaults underneath Christ Church. So he's finally laid to rest there for 63 years. So we're now up to 1892. There's a different church warden who can see he's got one too many occupied vaults for his records. So they think they know who this is because John Baskerville has technically been missing for 63 years, but they want to make sure. So yet again, the vault is opened. The coffin is removed, and once more the lid is prized off the coffin so they can check the inscriptions on the inside to confirm that this is John Baskerville. By now, it's just putrefying bones. And actually by now, it's finally a problem. I mean, it should have been a problem before then, but in 1892, questions are asked in Parliament about what's going on here in Birmingham. So they're instructed they have to reinter him into the burial vaults underneath Christ Church with a plaque to, officially confirm that this is the final resting place of John Baskerville. So finally he's laid to rest underneath Christ Church in Birmingham for 5 years until Christ Church is due to be demolished in 1897, and they have to find homes for all of the bodies that are buried there. So he finally makes his way over here to Worston Lane Cemetery, where he is finally interred in 1897 in consecrated ground, which was of course always against his wishes anyway. So poor old John Baskerville, certainly such an important guy in life, but certainly had quite an eventful time in death as well.
An eventful death indeed. So we decide not to bother poor John anymore and head out of Worston Lane Cemetery and to the edge of the Jewellery Quarter, where we have time for one last story.
Okay, so we're coming towards the edge of the Jewellery Quarter now. So we're on a road called Livery Street, and above us we've got the railway line that goes into Snow Hill Station. And just a little bit further up from where we're stood now, underneath the railway, but unfortunately we're not going to take you exactly there because it is so noisy there. I mean, you'd never hear the story that I'm about to tell you, but it marks the spot at Birmingham's only public hanging. So this is from 1806, and it's the hanging of a man called Philip Matzel for the shooting of a man called Robert Twyford. Now, Robert Twyford was a peace officer in Birmingham in 1806. So a peace officer was an early forerunner of a police officer before we had a police force here in Birmingham. So he was charged with keeping the peace in this area. Philip Matzel was a gang member in Birmingham. So presumably Robert Twyford was on to whatever nefarious activities Philip Matzel was up to, and Philip Matzel shot him just a little bit further up, as I say, underneath what's now the railway that's come through since. So Philip Matzel is charged with the shooting of Robert Twyford. Robert Twyford didn't die, so it wasn't actually murder. So Philip Matzel was sent to Warwick to be tried. Now, Birmingham was a lot smaller in 1806, and actually the centre for justice for the West Midlands was Warwick, so that's where we would send criminals like Philip Matzel. He was found guilty of the shooting of Robert Twyford and sentenced to hanging. Now, ordinarily, if a criminal is sentenced to hanging in Warwick, they are hanged in Warwick, which is why Birmingham hadn't had a public hanging before. But on this occasion, because Philip Matzel had shot a peace officer, they wanted to send a really clear message out to Brummies that you can't go shooting your peace officers. So they wanted him hanged back in Birmingham on roughly the spot where the shooting had taken place, just a little bit further up from where we're stood now. So They sent him back to Birmingham, and clearly Brummies were really hungry for a public hanging because we hadn't had one before. 40,000 people lined the streets for this hanging. In 1806, that's a third of the population of Birmingham. So yeah, really, really looking forward to this here in Birmingham. So they make quite an occasion of it. So he is paraded around the streets before he's hanged on a horse and cart, sat on top of the coffin that he is later going to be buried in. So he's been told by his prison guards that he's going to be buried in his boots. So when he's been taken to the scaffold, he kicks his boots off. I'm not going to be buried in my boots. Takes himself off the scaffold, throws himself off, saying, "Here goes," and is successfully hanged on that spot a little bit further up. Now, there are a few twists in this tale because he went to his death protesting his innocence right up until the end, and his friends continued to protest his innocence after he was hanged. In fact, I've even heard some people today who still tell this story who believe he was innocent. They point the finger at somebody else, his lover, a woman called Kit Pedley. Now, she was a member of a rival gang here in Birmingham. They say that she got Philip so drunk he was incapable of shooting anyone, took his coat, took his gun, and shot Robert Twyford herself. It's possible, but I'm a bit more sceptical because he didn't die. So unless he really didn't see anything, or Kit and Philip happened to look incredibly alike, I think he would have been able to tell the difference, but you never know. Maybe he didn't see who shot him. But there's another twist to this tale as well, because it seems, or we believe possibly, his friends managed to get him buried in St Philip's churchyard. Now, that's consecrated ground, and hanged criminals aren't supposed to be buried in consecrated ground. So is it for that reason, or is it because he died believing he was innocent that his ghost is still said to haunt the spot where he was hanged? So on my tours, I take people past that spot and up to St Philip's churchyard to see whether we meet him on the route.
I love that. That's such a great story. And we did manage to get the Birmingham gangs.
We've got some ducks as well. Yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah, definitely.
Well, it's certainly been great being back on the road. Now, if you fancy taking one of Al's dark tours in Birmingham, you can find links to his tour in the show notes. And if you ever find yourself in St Paul's Square, just remember, the reason you feel that little bit safer might be thanks to a policeman who is still on duty from beyond the grave. I'll be back next week with another eerie excursion, and this time will be in New York. But in the meantime, make sure to follow at Eerie Excursions on Instagram and YouTube, as well as subscribing to the podcast wherever you're listening to make sure you don't miss out on any more dark tales from around the UK, which, hey, may even be in a town near you.